No one noticed the child until she pointed. No one spoke after she did. The courtroom had been hot with tension since the start of the trial. On the left side of the gallery, a sea of navy blue uniforms sat rigidly, a wall of cold eyes and clenched jaws. On the right, the family of Jermaine Holloway, draped in grief, dressed in Sunday black even though it was Thursday afternoon. Cameras were forbidden, but it didn't matter. Every detail of this case had already exploded across the nation like a gas leak waiting for a single spark. And then she stood up, barely 3 feet tall, her curls wild and eyes too big for her small round face. The little girl wiggled out of her aunt's lap and wandered into the aisle. The bailiff stepped forward, but the judge, unexpectedly, raised his hand. "Let her be," Judge Malcolm said. His voice was gravel and silk, like someone who'd seen enough. Everyone watched as the child walked to the middle of the courtroom, turned, and looked straight at the K-9 unit sitting obediently near the defense table. The German Shepherd was a beautiful animal, trained, lethal, calm. It didn't growl, didn't bark. It simply stared back. She lifted a tiny finger, pointed at the dog, and with the clarity of a bell, said, "Bad dog." A silence fell so fast it felt like a wind had been sucked from the room. The officer beside the dog blinked twice, stiffened, and looked away. The prosecutors exchanged stunned glances. The defense attorney shifted in her seat. But the officers, the ones in the benches, with their bulletproof skin and steel bones, they began to lower their heads, one by one, without a word. Not from guilt, exactly, but from something heavier. It wasn't the words. It was who said them. That girl was Amari Holloway, Jermaine Holloway's niece. And Jermaine Holloway was dead, shot 5 times in the back during a traffic stop. His body had laid uncovered for 2 hours while his family screamed behind police tape. No gun was found. No drugs. Just a busted taillight, a misunderstanding, and a man who'd never make it home. And the dog officer Kilo had been there, trained to neutralize threats. He hadn't bitten Jermaine, but he had growled as Jermaine begged not to be shot. And 3-year-old Amari had been in the back seat, strapped into her car seat, watching her uncle die. The trial was supposed to be about procedure, about protocol, about whether Officer Langston reasonably believed his life was in danger. But it had already become something else, something ancient. It became about what little black girls see when they close their eyes. The prosecutor, a thin black woman named Denise Rowe, stood slowly. She didn't look at the dog. She looked at the jury. "We are not here to make enemies of dogs," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But when a trained animal acts out of fear or aggression, we put it down. We say, that is not acceptable in a civilized society. So I ask you, what do we do when a trained man acts the same way?" The defense jumped to object, of course. "Inflammatory," they said. "Irrelevant," they added. But the judge did not strike it. He simply nodded once. It was Amari who spoke again. Quiet, clear, loud enough to crack something ancient. "Uncle said don't bark." It didn't make sense at first until her aunt, finally coming to the aisle to retrieve her, knelt down and whispered through the tears. "What did you say, baby?" The girl repeated. "Uncle said don't bark." The dog barked. Then the man yelled. Then boom, 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 boom. Her hands mimicked a gun, finger by finger. The jury wasn't supposed to hear that. None of it was official testimony. She wasn't a witness. She wasn't even supposed to be in the room. But now, she was the room. And suddenly, the case wasn't about Officer Langston's fear. It was about Amari's memory. The rest of that day blurred into slow motion. Motions were filed. Objections were flung. But even as the lawyers did their dance, eyes kept sliding back to the little girl, now sleeping peacefully in her aunt's lap, a lemon lollipop clutched in her hand. Outside the courtroom, the protests swelled. Not just chants, but testimonies. Stories from others. Tales of fear, of humiliation, of dogs that weren't just animals but signals. Signals of control, of silence, of threat. Inside, jurors whispered in elevators. Clerks shared long looks. And the officers still couldn't raise their eyes. One in particular, Sergeant Hale, 20 years on the force, 3 commendations, stood longest after the court recessed. He looked at the dog, then at Amari, then slowly walked over, knelt beside the pew, and left his badge on the wood. Not a word, just the medal. When he stood, someone had already taken a photo. It would go viral by midnight. But none of that mattered to Amari. Because in her world, dogs were either good or bad. And this one had barked. And barking, to her, meant something terrible was coming. Something you couldn't take back. By the time the sun dipped behind the courthouse that day, a 3-year-old had redrawn the lines of guilt and innocence. Not with legal arguments or expert testimony, but with the raw, unbearable truth of witnessing injustice before she even knew how to spell the word. And the trial hadn't even reached the verdict yet. The morning after Amari's quiet declaration, the courtroom felt different. Not Calmerno. That would be too simple but weightier, as if everyone had woken up carrying invisible bricks in their chests. Judge Malcolm walked in 15 minutes late, a rarity for a man whose life had been ruled by the ticking of a courtroom clock. He didn't apologize. He just sat, looked at everyone, and sighed. "We continue," he said. But it was already clear nothing would be the same. The prosecution returned with evidence that had been buried in a side drawer for months. Bodycam footage, previously unlocked. It came not from Officer Langston, whose camera malfunctioned, but from his partner, Officer Reese. The video had no sound. Reese had switched to mute to take a personal call before the stop, but the images said everything. In the grainy clip, Jermaine Holloway is seen stepping out of his vehicle with both hands high. The police dog, Kilo, strains on his leash before being reined in. Langston raises his weapon not once, but twice. And Jermaine's lips are moving. He is clearly pleading. Then, in 3 seconds that stretch like a lifetime, Langston fires 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Jermaine crumples to the pavement like a collapsing kite. Officer Reese turns away, and in the background, barely visible, a car seat shakes violently. Amari, screaming in silence. The court watched in horror. Some gasped, others wept, and for the first time, Officer Langston looked human, sweating, eyes darting, jaw clenched like he was holding back vomit. He didn't testify. He couldn't. His lawyer claimed it was strategic. Everyone knew it was fear. The jury was told to disregard the child's actions from the day before. The judge instructed them, "Do not let emotion cloud your duty to reason." But even Judge Malcolm's voice wavered on the last word. Because the law may separate emotion from reason, but humanity doesn't. Later that day, a witness was brought to the stand. Mrs. Carol Benton, a retired K-9 handler with 28 years of experience in the force. A white woman, stern, with a drawl in her speech and military discipline in her spine. "Dogs don't lie," she began. The defense smiled. "But handlers do," she continued. The courtroom froze. "I've trained over 42 dogs. German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois. Dogs don't act aggressively unless prompted or mishandled. If Officer Langston's dog barked when Jermaine Holloway moved his hands up, something was wrong in that leash." The defense objected. Speculation. But it was too late. The jury had already heard it. Mrs. Benton wasn't finished. "I watched that tape," she said. "That dog wasn't scared. He was responding to his handler's tension." Which means either the officer lost control or used the dog to justify what he was about to do. "Are you implying," the defense lawyer asked, "that Officer Langston intended to shoot?" "No. I'm saying the dog knew before the officer did." She stepped down to stunned silence. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, something remarkable had begun. It started with a sidewalk chalk drawing, a child's sketch of Amari standing before a dog, tiny speech bubble above her that read, "Bad dog." Within hours, more appeared in buildings, bus stops, park benches. Across the city, little Amari had become a symbol not of rebellion, but of conscience. A conscience that didn't care about legal nuance, that simply called a thing what it was. Back in court, the defense tried desperately to pivot. They brought in Langston's service record, clean, decorated, model cop. They showed his commendation for disarming a violent suspect without force. They spoke of his 2 children, his church involvement. They painted a picture of a man under pressure, overwhelmed, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the picture didn't erase the video. It didn't erase the 5 shots. And it didn't erase Amari. In a last-ditch effort, they called Officer Reese to the stand. He looked younger than his badge suggested. His eyes darted toward Amari once she wasn't looking. She was coloring in her notebook with a blue crayon. "Did you see Mr. Holloway pose a threat?" the defense asked. Reese hesitated, swallowed, then said the word that cracked the courtroom open. "No." No one exhaled. "You're under oath, officer." I know. And you're saying Jermaine Holloway posed no threat? I'm saying I didn't see one. I didn't feel one. And I didn't hear one. If you want me to lie, I can't. Then why didn't you stop your partner? He looked down. Because I froze. Because you were scared? He looked up. Because I was complicit. Another silence. One you could hear screaming through. Outside, someone had written in red chalk. Even the quiet ones know. The judge adjourned early that day. He said he needed time to review procedural matters. Everyone knew he just needed to breathe. The jury began deliberations the next morning. 12 men and women, black, white, brown. Teachers, veterans, one retired EMT. They deliberated for 6 hours. While they did, Amari played with her doll. Her aunt, exhausted, dozed in the corner. The gallery remained full, tense. Word had spread far beyond the city. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera all had crews stationed outside. And in the parking lot, candles burned around a photo of Jermaine Holloway smiling in a backyard, flipping burgers, holding Amari on his shoulders. The jury returned. Judge Malcolm took his seat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. A black man in his 60s. Former principal. A deep crease between his brows. We have, Your Honor. Langston stood as the clerk read. On the charge of second-degree manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. Langston didn't blink. On the charge of use of excessive force under color of law, guilty. A tremble passed through the courtroom. Amari looked up from her drawing. The officers in the back row, some stayed still. Some stood and walked out. But a very few bowed their heads. Because they knew what came next wasn't just justice. It was reckoning. Judge Malcolm set sentencing for 2 weeks later. But the verdict had already echoed far past the walls. On the courthouse steps, Denise Rose stood before the microphones. Her voice was soft, but steady. This case was never about hatred. It was about recognition. About whether we, as a country, can admit that harm exists even when it wears a badge. Today, a little girl reminded us that the truth isn't always complicated. Sometimes it's just bad dog. Behind her, Amari clutched her aunt's hand and smiled. But this wasn't the end. Because across the country, in department meetings, in police academies, in locker rooms and legal panels, the question began to rise. What happens when the people we train to protect us are taught to fear us first? And what happens when children become the only ones brave enough to speak? Amari wouldn't know all that. Not for years. But she would grow up in a world slightly changed. A world that remembered her not just as the child in the courtroom, but as the one who spoke when everyone else stayed silent. She didn't know what justice meant. But she knew the sound of barking. And she knew it meant something was very, very wrong. The days after the verdict didn't feel like victory. Not to Amari's family. Not to Jermaine's mother, who still sat at her kitchen table every morning pouring 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, and one for a son who would never drink it. Not to Denise Rowe, who returned to her office late that night and cried silently into her palms, not out of sadness, but exhaustion. Justice, she realized, wasn't a finish line. It was just the least you could do and still call yourself a country. Officer Langston was sentenced to 17 years. A number that didn't balance the scales, but at least acknowledged the weight. His badge was revoked, his pension cut. He didn't speak during sentencing. Only once when the judge asked if he had anything to say did he murmur, "I wish I'd waited half a second." That was the closest he came to regret. But it wasn't just about him anymore. Because across the city, protests gave way to town halls. Police oversight boards were no longer empty seats and echoing promises. Parents showed up. Teachers. Former officers. A movement formed, not a fiery rebellion, but something deeper, the quiet, stubborn act of paying attention. They called it Amari's Law. It started small, a statewide mandate that all patrol units must carry trauma kits designed for child witnesses. Then came the bigger shifts, mandatory K-9 handler audits, body cam regulations that couldn't be overridden, and an independent civilian review board with actual power to investigate. And yet, real change always finds its enemies. A week after sentencing, someone spray-painted the Holloway house. Big black letters across their garage, "Play stupid games." Jermaine's mother didn't call the police. She just painted over it in white. And in red, beneath the fresh coat, she wrote, "My son was not a game." The next morning, dozens of neighbors showed up with brushes and buckets. By sundown, the garage had become a mural. Amari was at the center, standing in front of a dog whose eyes weren't angry but sad. Around her, the words, she pointed. We listened. But not everyone listened. An op-ed ran in the local paper the next day, titled, The Dangerous Simplicity of a Child's Judgment. The author, a former deputy, wrote, We are raising a generation who will see every uniform as a threat, every officer as a villain. What does that do to the fabric of order? Denise Rowe read it at her desk. She didn't laugh. She didn't curse. She just clipped it out, folded it carefully, and slid it into a file marked Amari Holloway Archive. Because that's what stories like that became. Artifacts of resistance to change. But Amari wasn't resisting. She was just trying to be a child again. For the first time in weeks, her aunt took her to the park. The sun was high, the grass wet, and other children ran wild with laughter and popsicles. Amari held a stuffed dog under one arm and a juice pouch in the other. When a Real dog passed by a golden retriever this time she froze. Its leash was tight. Its tongue was out. It wasn't barking, just walking. Still, Amari watched it until it was gone. Then whispered, That one's good. Her aunt knelt beside her. How can you tell? Amari shrugged. Didn't growl. The innocence wasn't gone. Just filtered, like sunlight through stained glass. Still bright, but changed. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Sergeant Hale, the officer who had left his badge on the pew, stood before a class of new recruits. Y'all know who I am, he said. I've seen everything. Every kind of protest, complaint, and traffic stop you can imagine. He held up his old badge. This used to mean something to me. He set it on the desk. Now? Not enough. The recruits were silent. You'll be taught tactics, policies, de-escalation. What they won't teach you is this. Every time you step out of your cruiser, someone's child is watching. Maybe from a window, maybe from a back seat, maybe from under a blanket, trying to sleep while you yell through their door. He paused. And sometimes they grow up quiet, but sometimes they point. That day, one recruit quit. Not out of fear, but because she realized she couldn't be the kind of officer that job demanded anymore. 2 others stayed, but differently. Woke up, paid attention. Small seeds. Elsewhere, the video of Amari in the courtroom, recorded illegally by someone near the back, leaked online. It was only 7 seconds. Just her voice, clear as crystal, bad dog. It went viral. People debated it, fought about it, memed it, but they couldn't ignore it. One video response, stitched from hundreds of TikToks, showed children of all races, all countries, pointing at different symbol statues, guns, flags, and saying what they saw: bad, sad, scary, wrong. And always, at the end, Amari. The public turned her into an emblem. But in her aunt's house, she was still just a girl who liked yellow cereal and hated socks. Who asked, once, why her uncle didn't come back yet, even though everyone said he was in the sky. I don't see no airplanes, she whispered. Her aunt had no answer, just wrapped her tighter in the blanket. You don't have to see him, baby. Just remember. The next morning, Amari drew a picture. It was her and Jermaine, holding hands under a cloud shaped like a dog. In the corner, a speech bubble from the cloud said, sorry. When her aunt saw it, she smiled through tears. Looks like forgiveness, she whispered. But not everyone was ready for forgiveness. Weeks later, Officer Langston appealed. His new attorney claimed media bias, unconstitutional emotional influence, and prejudicial exposure. He filed for a retrial. The petition made it to the state court. But then something unexpected happened. One of the justices on the reviewing panel asked for a private interview. Not with lawyers. With Amari. It wasn't official. Couldn't be. But she had questions and she wanted to understand the heart of the matter, not the law. So Amari, now 4 and more curious than ever, was brought in with her aunt. A quiet room. No robes. Just a woman in a blue sweater, kneeling to eye level. Do you remember what you said in court? Amari nodded. Why did you say it? Amari tilted her head. Because he barked. Who? The dog. And then the man got loud. And Uncle got scared. Did your uncle tell you what to say? Amari blinked. No. The judge leaned closer. Did anyone? Amari shook her head, then reached for the judge's hand. Are you scared too? The judge paused. Sometimes. Amari nodded. It's okay. I get scared lots. And just like that, the appeal died in the cradle. Because you can't legislate away the truth from the eyes of a child. And no courtroom, no matter how high the ceilings or grand the language, can silence it once it's spoken, especially when it comes as soft as a whisper and hits as hard as justice. A year later, on the anniversary of Jermaine Holloway's death, the city held a vigil. It wasn't political. There were no banners, no chants. Just candles, hundreds of them lining the courthouse steps, flickering like tiny promises. People brought photographs, teddy bears, folded notes of apology addressed not to the family, but to the idea of silence. Amari stood at the front. She was taller now, her face more serious, her curls tied in two careful puffs. In her small hands, she held a single daisy. The mayor, a white man elected months after the trial, stepped forward to speak. His voice cracked before he reached his second sentence. We failed him, and we almost failed her. No one clapped. It wasn't the time. He continued. We are here not just to remember Jermaine Holloway, but to commit, to listen, and to protect our children not from monsters, but from systems that let monsters hide. Then he stepped back. The mic stayed empty until Amari's aunt gently nudged her forward. She didn't need to speak, but she wanted to. She walked up, stood on a small stool someone had placed at the podium, and looked out. The crowd was utterly still. I miss my uncle. Her voice was clear, tiny, fearless. He made me pancakes. He told me dogs are supposed to be kind. That barking was for warning, not hurting. She paused, looked at her flower. I think the dog didn't mean to be bad. I think he got scared too. People shifted in the crowd, tears beginning to surface. I hope people stop yelling and listen more. I think if they listen, the dogs won't bark so much. She stepped down. The silence that followed felt sacred. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed and streetlights hummed on, Amari's aunt wrapped her in her coat and whispered, You did good, baby. Amari looked up. I didn't do nothing big. Just said what I saw. Her aunt nodded. That's the hardest part sometimes. In the weeks that followed, her small speech rippled far and wide. School districts began incorporating trauma-informed training. Police departments in 3 states launched new K-9 review protocols. One city passed a resolution banning dogs at traffic stops altogether unless there was confirmed danger. But deeper than policy, something else began to shift. Language. People started saying the names of victims without following them with but. Jermaine Holloway was no longer the man who resisted. He was a father figure, a brother, a soul. His humanity had been restored not by evidence, but by the clarity of a child. Years passed. Amari grew. She never forgot what she saw, but she didn't let it define her. Her aunt made sure of that. They planted sunflowers in the backyard. Amari joined the chess club. She learned to read early, favoring books with animals and heroes who used their words instead of swords. At 8, she told her class she wanted to be a kindness teacher. When her teacher asked what that meant, Amari said, It's someone who reminds people how to be nice when they forget. At 10, a documentary crew reached out. They wanted to interview her for a piece called The Girl Who Pointed. Her aunt declined. She's not a symbol, she said. She's a child. Let her be. But at 12, Amari said yes. I think people forgot, she told the camera. And forgetting is what makes it happen again. She didn't cry on camera. She didn't smile either. She just told the truth. The video went viral again. And this time, it started something new. A national initiative, the Amari Project. Its mission was simple: train first responders on child-centered trauma response, especially in Black and Brown communities. It offered therapy grants to families whose children had witnessed police violence. It created safe spaces for kids to speak without pressure, without fear. By 15, Amari was traveling. Not for photo ops. For listening. She met other children. Sat in gymnasiums and community centers, listening to stories that mirrored her own in quiet, devastating ways. A boy in Detroit who hid under a porch during a raid. A girl in Atlanta who stopped talking for 6 months after her brother was arrested at gunpoint. A child in Tulsa who drew only in black crayon for an entire year. Amari didn't offer advice. She offered company. Her presence, alone, older now, still soft-spoken, still grounded, was enough to open them up. I believe you, she'd say. And I know it hurt. And with that, healing began. Not perfectly, not fully, but honestly. Meanwhile, across the country, resistance remained. There were still officers who scoffed at her name. Still pundits who called her a prop for guilt. Still lawmakers who tried to gut funding from the Amari project every budget cycle. But there were also those who carried her photo in their wallets, who invoked her name in courtrooms, who pointed at injustice and whispered, "Bad dog." It had become a code, not to vilify, but to name, a call out of harm, a refusal to pretend silence was safety. At 18, Amari graduated valedictorian of her class. Her speech didn't mention the courtroom, or the trial, or even her uncle. It spoke of story. How we tell it matters, she said. Whether we make the villain loud and the victim small, whether we choose silence or voice, whether we point and stay pointed. She paused, then added, "We live in a world where it's easier to be afraid than to be kind. But fear makes you bark. Kindness makes you stay." The room erupted in applause. That summer, she received a letter. From prison. It was from Officer Langston. The handwriting was shaky. He wrote, "I have no right to ask you anything. But I saw your interview. I watched it 5 times. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know I remember your voice more than the gunfire. And I wish I'd heard it before I pulled the trigger." Amari didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her life was her answer. By 25, she held a doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on child trauma and systemic oppression. She led seminars titled The Echo of Barking: How Early Encounters with Authority Shaped the Black Child's Psyche. Law enforcement was required to attend. Many walked in skeptical. Most left changed. One officer, graying, approached her after a session. "I was there," he said. "That day? In the courtroom?" Amari tilted her head. "Were you one of the ones who bowed their head?" He nodded. "I didn't know why then. I just knew I had to." She smiled. "Sometimes our bodies know the truth before our minds catch up." He stared at her a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you for not stopping." She looked him in the eye. "I didn't point to destroy. I pointed to begin." At 32, Amari stood before the United Nations to deliver a keynote on restorative justice. Her name was now synonymous with clarity, compassion, courage. She began with the same words she used as a child. "Bad dog." Laughter rippled. But then she explained. It was never about the dog, or the badge, or even the gun. It was about fear, and what fear teaches us to do when we feel power over someone who can't fight back. She paused, then added, "The opposite of fear is not courage. It's care." And that became the headline. Years later, a statue was unveiled outside that same courthouse where it all began. Not of Jermaine, not of a dog, but of a little girl pointing, not accusing, but illuminating. At the base, a plaque read, "She saw what we refused to. She said what we wouldn't. She reminded us how to begin." Every year on the anniversary of Jermaine's death, candles return to those steps. And somewhere in the crowd, often unnoticed, a woman stands quietly tall, dignified, her curls tied back, eyes watchful. Amari, still pointing, not in blame, but in truth. Always in truth. The end. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.